Good day, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining today's edition of Teneo Insights. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York City. Following the poor performance of parties supporting him in the European parliamentary elections, President Emmanuel Macron of France surprised many by taking the enormous gamble, dissolving the National Assembly and calling early legislative elections. Recent polls show the National Rally Party of Marine Le Pen well ahead of other parties. As for Europe more broadly, while the political center was able to maintain its majority in the European parliamentary elections, nevertheless, far-right parties made substantial gains. So here today to discuss the upcoming election in France and its implications, what the European parliamentary elections tell us about Europe, and also a quick preview of the UK elections next Thursday, July the 4th, I'm joined by two of my colleagues. Antonio Barroso is a managing director with Teneo Political Risk Advisory, which he co-launched in 2013. He is the Deputy Director of Research, and he leads the analysis of political and regulatory dynamics in key EU markets, including France. And he joins us today from just outside Geneva, Switzerland. Stéphane Dupuis is a Managing Director with Teneo Strategy and Communications based in Paris, where he joins us from today. Prior to joining Teneo, Stéphane was the French Deputy Secretary General for European Affairs, reporting to the Prime Minister's office. And before that was the Counselor on Competition and Antitrust to the permanent representation of France to the European Union. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. And let's start with the French election. The first round is this coming Sunday, June 30th. And Antonio, perhaps I can start with you. Maybe give the audience here the state of the race as you see it and as the polls are indicating right now. But before you do so, maybe step back for just a moment and tell us how we got here and how we got to this point that on that surprising day earlier this month, just after polls closed in Europe, that Macron made this surprise call.
Hi, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast. Look, I think the main question is, why did he do this? And the short answer is nobody knows. Even people from his own party was not aware that he wanted to dissolve the National Assembly. So we can only speculate. I think there are two possible answers that are related. The first one is a short-term one. The government of Prime Minister Gabriel Attal was supposed to face a very tough autumn with a draft budget for 2025 that was to include around 20 billion euros in cuts. And the government, as you know, doesn't have a majority in the National Assembly. So it would have been very difficult, and possibly the government would have had to face a number of no confidence motions by other parties to facing possibly a collapse. So I think Macron wanted to basically clarify the situation and tell to the other parties, well, if you think it's so easy, then try, right? So I think that's one of the reasons. In the long-term reason that some people are speculating with is the fact that maybe by facilitating possibly government by the far right is just showing people that the far right, the National Rally of Marine Le Pen, is unprepared for power. And that way, what you do is anticipating the shock from 2027, when the next presidential election is supposed to be held, to now 2024, right? So it's these two short-term and long-term goals that maybe Macron is pursuing with this election.
So just a very quick question on this, because the outcome of the European parliamentary elections in terms of the French element of that wasn't a complete surprise. And yet we saw the now kind of iconic photo of Macron in the cabinet meeting and Attal, Prime Minister Attal, who's one of his key confidants and potential successor in his party, sort of sitting there with his arms crossed. He had only been notified a few moments before that decision. So why was this particular strategy not something that had been more actively discussed? If the outcome of the European parliamentary election had been what it in fact was.
Well, I think it's in line with the way Macron acts normally. He keeps the most important decisions very close to his chest. And I think he was trying to trigger some kind of shock effect, right? Given that basically the National Rally had a very strong victory in the European Parliament elections of 9 June in France. I think he wanted to take advantage of that shock to basically, have an influence, try to influence the outcome of the election, right? But to be honest, it's just the way Macron works. Like I can point at, X number of statements, whether it's on foreign policy or domestic policy issues, where people very close to him were not aware of his strategy, right? So I think it's in line with his personality.
So, Stéphane, I want to bring you into this conversation here as well in terms of the Macron motivation, and in terms of, and we'll get to the polls here in a second and what you guys think about the potential outcomes on Sunday and in the second round. But just going back to this point about Macron's motivation and the strategy, the sort of the role of the dice he's really taking here. How do you look at that?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I fully agree with Antonio. In fact, it seems that President Macron wanted to be still the, let's say, master of the clock, and not be in a position just to see things happening without controlling them. So this decision indeed seems to really have been taken by the president with his 4 or 5 special advisors in the Élysée Palace. Seems indeed that the Prime Minister was just informed a few hours before the decision was made public. It was made public just 1 hour after the results were disclosed. So it was quite quick, in fact. And when people in France understood that the president was about to express himself, everybody, we were all wondering, what is he going to say, in fact, just commenting the defeat, or will he dissolve the National Assembly? But as you know, the presidential party also kept saying during the European campaign that there will be no national decisions to be taken from the results of the European elections. That was quite a shock. And I think that he really wanted to shock the political parties and the voters, and to tell them, hey, you have to choose really now, in fact, at the end of the month, if you wish to vote for extremes, the far left or the far right, or to governing parties such as mine. And in fact, the plan seems to be that President Macron was supposed to drive the campaign, intervening in the press 3 times a week during the 3 weeks between the result of the European election and the first round of the snap election, to lead the campaign and really to explain that people in France have to be reasonable and vote for him. But the fact is that there is a lot of anger and a lot of misunderstanding of the decision to dissolve the National Assembly, because in fact, also and maybe we'll have a close discussion on a quick discussion on the results on the European elections and the European Parliament. But there is no need, in fact, to dissolve there was no need to dissolve the National Assembly, because the balance of power in the European Parliament is not really changed, in fact.
So just given that, picking up on that last point, Stéphane, tell us, so much of our audience is based here in the United States and in the UK. Talk a little bit about what the reaction was in the French body politic to this announcement Sunday night, and then in Le Monde and the Figaro the next morning, Monday morning. What was the national response? Was it sort of shock and or how seismic of an event was this scene?
Frankly, it was a big shock. It was a big shock for everyone because there was an absolute misunderstanding of the rationale of this decision, because it seems to everybody, and when you speak in the streets and in the metro, in the restaurants, everybody now, we're a highly politicized country, but imagine the conversations around a glass of wine. We just took politics and tried to find out what kind of scenarios we will face in July. So first, first point, the decision is not understood. People don't understand why the president dissolved the National Assembly when the national rally is so high. And it's the first time the national rally wins, so the far right wins an election with twice as the numbers of the second party, which is Renaissance Party, the party of the president. The fact that he dissolved the National Assembly 1 hour after the result of the European election seems that he had thought a lot about dissolving the National Assembly before, but all the president of the allies of President Macron, such as former Prime Minister Edouard Philippe, said, for instance, that he was not in the loop of this decision. He didn't know about it. He was just informed a few hours before by the president. And for instance, Edouard Philippe decided to play his own card now, saying his party Horizon will present deputies. I mean, its own deputies to the snap election, which are not deputies with Renaissance. I mean, and Edouard Philippe really wants to play his card for the presidential election in 2027 and to appear as, centrist and rational. It seems that there is a lot, there has been a lot of anger for President Macron's policy for a lot of years now, because of the retirement reform, for instance, because of the unemployment reform. But now there is also a complete misunderstanding of what his plans are.
So let's unpack some of that here in a moment. But Antonio, let's talk to the audience here about what the polls are currently showing and what the sort of scenarios look like in terms of what the outcome could be.
Sure. So opinion polls are showing that the National Rally is well ahead, the far-right party of Marine Le Pen, with around 33% of the vote, more or less, depending on the polls. Then behind them, you have the New Popular Front, which is a coalition of left-wing parties that go from far-left parties to the Socialist Party, which is a social democratic party, right? And they are around 30%. And then way behind, you have the pro-Macron coalition of parties, right? Around 20, 25, 4%, depending on what poll you look at. The problem is that the polls don't tell you much about whether the parties, which party will have an absolute majority of seats in the assembly, because, this is the kind of election that political nerds kind of love. Markets don't like it because of the uncertainty, but, we political nerds love it because it's a two-round system in which you have 577 constituencies, right? Because you have 577 seats in the National Assembly. And then,
and just to be clear, so voters are voting for each of those constituents. This is not a party list kind of an election, right? So there are local idiosyncrasies and local elements in all of these seats as well.
Exactly, and people vote for their deputy, right? Pretty much like it happens in the United Kingdom, for example. But at the same time, it's a two-round system, which means that only certain candidates go to the second round, those who qualify. And then you might have weird situations in which, for example, you might have a far-left candidate against a far-right candidate. Then what do centrist voters do, right? That's why pollsters in France constantly warn people about the fact that it's very difficult to estimate the number of seats accurately. They provide margins that are very wide. Like, for example, you can see polls showing that the National Rally might have between 230 seats and 270 seats, for example, which is huge, right? It's a huge variability, right? So it's very difficult to do seat estimates for legislative elections in France.
And so, how does somebody qualify for the second round?
So basically, for the first round, you need to have an absolute majority to basically get the seat, but it's very difficult. I think last time in 2022, you had as many as 5 seats only that were won in the first round.
Only 5 seats were won clear in the first round. Got it.
Exactly. So then you need a minimum of 2.5% of the vote to basically go to the second round, which is interesting because then it's not that you might have runoffs between 2 candidates. You can have even 3-way and even 4-way races, right? Last time you didn't have that many 3-way races, but it makes it even more unpredictable because you might have a far-right party, someone from the pro-Macron coalition of parties, and someone from the far left.
So, okay, so now, given all of that, let's talk about the scenarios of outcomes here, which seems to me that it's either going to be potentially the Marine Le Pen RN with a absolute majority, or they don't get a majority and you could head toward a hung parliament type of a scenario. Or there might be, is there a scenario in which the left actually prevails? Go through the scenarios and where you think the likelihood, in order of likelihood.
Sure, I'm talking about realistic scenarios, right? So I think
yes, realistic.
The most likely scenario with all the caveats that we have mentioned, given how difficult it is to do seat estimates, is a hung parliament, actually, because the polls are showing that no single party or coalition of parties will have an absolute majority, which is 289 seats in the 577-seat National Assembly, right? The second scenario you might have is actually a victory by the National Rally with an absolute majority, right? And that leads to cohabitation. That means a president that is from a different political color than the prime minister, and we can talk about the implications of that. And then the third scenario, in order of likelihood, I think it will be a victory by absolute majority of the new Popular Front, for the coalition of left-wing parties. I don't mention a victory from the pro-Macron parties because no single poll gives them any realistic chance of basically winning the election.
So, Stéphane, let's talk a little bit about the implications here, because it seems like, to Antonio's final point there, that none of the polls are showing a Macron victory, if you will. And it seems as if he's having a very challenging time landing this kind of core message, right? That his party is the only one with the credibility on the economic and public finances front, in a sense. And both the RN and the NFP, both the right and the left, look like they are talking about huge fiscal expansion in many ways. But having said that, the RN polls, best in terms of improving living standards, in terms of reducing unemployment, even though that's been one of the hallmarks of Macron's administration, bringing unemployment down, and that they would be the most trusted to reduce the deficit and debt levels of France. So talk a bit about the platforms to the extent that we know them, considering how short this campaign period is, and what the implications are from the scenarios that Antonio just laid out.
Yeah, it's very difficult to predict what the different programs will be. In fact, there is a lot of communication by the different parties, the National Rally, the new Popular Front. But in fact, what is interesting to see is that they are not really aligned. I mean, you hear different voices inside the National Rally on the economic policy they want to put in place, for instance. Same for the new Popular Front. So it's not really clear to have a precise image of what they really wish to do if either the right, or I mean the extreme right or the extreme left wins the elections and go to Matignon as in the prime minister's office. What is sure is that as you, I mean, you're fully right, Kevin. Those economic programs would be very, expensive, let's say, for French public finances. In a situation where Bruno Le Maire, as our Minister for Economy, Industry and Competitiveness, said that he had to find 20 billion euros savings, in fact, now to respect the public finance strategy President Macron wanted for France, and to reach, the Maastricht criteria of 3% of GDP as a deficit and 60% GDP as public debt. So what is sure is that there is a lot of communications, but it's quite difficult to see what the outcome of the discussion inside the new Popular Front and inside also the National Rally will be. And fully agree with Antonio. I think that scenario one is not the National Rally winning the elections with an absolute majority. So then what would happen? In fact, if they don't have an absolute majority, they will have to find a compromise with the right, with Les Républicains, with the right, maybe with the center right and right, to have the 289 seats they need. To pass laws. So if they don't have an absolute, if they have an absolute majority, they can implement their program until 2027, and that's it. That's done. If they don't have an absolute majority, it's another trick. It's another game which is going to be played. And maybe just one thing also, we could even if the National Rally has, let's say, imagine that the National Rally has an absolute majority. Then it's going to be a weak majority, in fact, because a majority with also former Républicains, former governing right. And first thing that Jordan Bardella, as Prime Minister would do is to try to pass a budget bill as of July, or even as of just September. He has, in any case, he has to present a budget bill to the new National Assembly early October. What would happen then? Would this bill be voted by the National Rally and the Republican allies or not? If it's not voted, then we have an issue, and it could well be that the government would like to use one of the most well-known articles of the French Constitution, which is Article 49.3, which says that the government can pass a bill through the National Assembly without a vote if there is no vote of no confidence to the government. But then, as you know, President Macron used, and Elisabeth Borne as Prime Minister, Gabriel Attal as Prime Minister, used this article to pass almost 20 laws, I guess, during the last 2 years. But then it would be the first time that the National Rally, being the head of the government, would decide to use this article to pass a law. Who would vote for the National Rally government and who would vote against? Because if then there is a majority to vote against the National Rally government, then we could well end with, a new government, that's for sure. That's the direct consequence of such a vote. And then for President Macron to find a way to have a new prime minister, more consensual, and then maybe we'll end in a few weeks or months with a government of technicians. See, and you can hear a lot of, discussions around. And what about having, for instance, in a scenario, Jordan Bardella as prime minister for a few weeks or months, and then ending with the government with Christine Lagarde as prime minister, for instance. See what I mean? We could well end even before the end of the year with the government of technicians having a majority from the Républicains with the center, with the Socialist Party and the Greens. Let's say a governing consensus, a governing alliance without the extreme left and the extreme right.
Antonio, did you want to add something there?
Thank you. I completely agree with everything that Stéphane said. Actually, I think one interesting thing you have seen in the last few days is that the National Rally is starting to get a little bit nervous as they get closer to power. So on two issues. First, in the scenario where they don't have an absolute majority, Jordan Bardella, who Stéphane mentioned, and is the candidate to be prime minister, even though, you don't elect a candidate to become
should
prime
note
minister.
For the audience that he is only 28 years old.
Indeed. He's the current president of the party, but he's only 28 years old. He's very popular, actually, when you look at opinion polls. But he has suggested that he actually will not govern if he doesn't have an absolute majority. Because I think both Le Pen and Bardella started to get, they saw what happened to the current government, getting burned out by not having a majority and having to use Article 49.3 all the time. So probably they started to get worried about that scenario, in which case, we will go to the scenario that Stéphane has mentioned. What happens? Macron will have to look for someone to basically govern the country, because Macron cannot dissolve the National Assembly again within a year, right? After, the current dissolution. So that's, it tells you a lot about how the National Rally is thinking. And then second, even from a policy standpoint, if the National Rally has an absolute majority, they could do a lot of things. But, even in terms of the economic measures they are proposing, they're being very ambiguous, because I think they're starting to also to get worried. They realize that they cannot deliver on many of the things that they have promised in the past, right? So yesterday, Jordan Bardella was presenting the economic program of the National Rally, and he was mentioning things such as, we're going to reduce social charges for employers, and we're going to do this and that. And many of the measures were actually quite similar to the ones that the current government is already implementing, right? Then there are other things, like, for example, reducing VAT, which is more controversial because, from a European standpoint, it's difficult to do, but also will increase the deficit a lot. But you can see already that they're starting to think that this might not be as easy as they thought.
Obviously, to the outsider, and I suspect many in the audience, what the two of you have just described sounds incredibly complicated in many ways. But the other takeaway I have, based on everything that Stéphane was saying, is that the French voter in a sense, doesn't even really know what they're ultimately voting for here, because you might wind up with these various scenarios playing out over the course of even this year. So, at the end of the day, are voters voting for the RN in your view, or are they voting against everything else? Like, we've tried the left, we've tried the center. Like, these guys can't be any worse than the last few administrations. So let's give them their shot. Or is it a genuine belief in in the platform that they're espousing?
Maybe I can begin to try to answer Kevin on that. I think there is first the driver of the vote is to vote against Macron, frankly. Vote against Macron. It was the driver of the vote during the European campaign, and it explains really, frankly, almost half of the result of the national rally in the European elections. Same, I think, for the next snap elections. And second, I think that there is something that maybe the governing parties have not understood as they should. Is first, I think, a feeling of poorness, a feeling of being forgotten, by people in outside the big cities of France. Because when you see the map of the results of the European elections, in fact, you have 96 constituencies out of 100 which have voted for the national rally. And they're not just racists, in fact. They're not racists. All the people in those 96 constituencies are not racist. They have voted for the national rally because they think they are forgotten by the elite, by the governing parties, which have made a lot of promise, and they don't see anything. They see post offices closed. They see less transport than before. They see train station closing, and so on and so forth. And they think that globalization, European Union are only working for rich people, not for them. And it's one of the issues also when you try to explain the benefits of the European Union to the French citizens, because when you try to explain what citizens gain from the European Union, you explain, for instance, that roaming costs have been deleted, but this is something you benefit from when you travel. But a lot of people in France don't travel, so they don't really care if they go to Germany, they don't pay roaming because they don't go to Germany, in fact. See? So there is a strong feeling that everything which is happening is not for them. They are outsiders, and they want to become insiders. So I really think that the high percentage of the national array is explained by that. Same for La France Insoumise, the extreme left. And I think also there is really a perception of immigration which is really problematic also in the French campaigns, in the French also outside the city, in the cities, but outside the cities. And whether you believe or not that immigration is an issue, I think that for governing parties, you really have to show that you address immigration. And it's so easy to explain that, all the difficulties come from the outside, come from the immigration. It's difficult to explain what you can do to control immigration when you have such an issue with illegal immigrants in Europe now. So I think there is a mix of anger against President Macron, feeling of being forgotten in European or national politics, and also the issue of immigration.
Well, I know you're talking about France, but I have to assume that many in the audience, like myself, sitting in a lot of other countries, probably can relate exactly to what you were just talking to in terms of the domestic political dynamics that we're facing as well. So it's a good moment to kind of segue to talking about Europe a little bit more. But before I do, Antonio, if we assume for a second one of the more extreme scenarios, although it seemed to be you guys agree is sort of the second likeliest, which is an absolute majority for the RN. If they that, and Bardella then becomes the prime minister, notwithstanding that Macron and the Elysee Palace will, there will be this, kind of everybody's trying to block the other, either from the executive or in the parliament. But do you see a scenario, and we'll talk about this a little bit when we get to Europe, but the one European leader who came out looking good from the European parliamentary elections was Giorgia Meloni in Italy, who also came from a far right perspective, but has sort of pivoted economically, at least, into a more mainstream position, more working with the European institutions and the like. Do you see the RN making a similar sort of strategic pivot like that, or what?
Several things here. The first one is to understand that if we are in that situation, you might have a certain cacophony of voices, because the president in the semi-presidential system in France retains a very powerful voice, right? Especially on international affairs and on defense issues. But de facto, the national rally government will have practically all the power, right? It will implement, it will approve, adopt a budget, send it to parliament.
Got the power of the purse.
Yeah, exactly, the power of the purse. And I think one signpost to have in relation to what you're saying, right? I think we're different situation of Italy where, I think Meloni had the previous experience of a government where La Lega, was a part of. And it was, a government that ended up with Mario Draghi, a technocrat, being appointed prime minister, right? So I think Meloni had that experience and knew how to basically portray herself as a moderate, at least vis-a-vis other European leaders. Here, you will have this cacophony of voices, which wouldn't allow basically Bardella to emerge as the main leader. And also remember, Bardella will be the prime minister, but the one who is sitting on the sides waiting to be the actual leader is Marine Le Pen, right? But I think one signpost to see where the national rally would go would be the appointment of the finance minister, the finance or economy minister, right? I think that's hugely important. They have signaled they will appoint someone with credibility and so on. But there's one problem, which is the national rally really doesn't have a lot of competent policy elites. They struggle to find enough candidates to run in all the 577 constituencies, right? And this is a systematic problem that far-right parties have had in Europe, right? So I think one of the main challenges that we're going to see if they come to power is that they don't have enough people to put in key positions. Marine Le Pen has been talking about a national unity government, but what she means by that is actually a government of the right. It has nothing to do with national unity, right? Oh. So I think the lack of competent policy elites might be an issue that might prevent, even if they want to, portray themselves as moderate and implement moderate policy, there's a lot of room for surprises and a lot of room for improvisation in a government led by them.
What is this, Stéphane? What is this dynamic that's unfolding in France right now? What is this signaling to Europe? I was struck the other day when it seemed to me a departure from norms when the Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, in a TV interview said essentially, that he was hoping that parties, quote, that are not Le Pen win. I mean, here's the leader of another government inserting himself into an election in the neighboring country. But what does that tell you? How is the rest of Europe looking at this election?
Yeah, there is, well, as you know, the snap election arrived just after the European election. So in fact, there is there are every week now discussions with EU leaders to decide on the top jobs. European Commissioner, President of the European Commission, European Commissioners, President of the European Parliament, and so on and so forth. So this week, we'll have a new European Council. President Macron will attend the European Council. And it's going to be tricky for President Macron and also for the next Prime Minister to have 100% power on the French European policy, in fact, because what is tricky and what you have, the functioning of the European Union is quite complex. But just to make it in a nutshell, two ideas to have in mind. President Macron will still attend the European Council as President of France. there is no meeting for the Prime Minister of France in Brussels. So the next Prime Minister won't attend any meeting, any Prime Minister meeting, because there is none, in fact. And ministers of the French government will participate to a ministerial councils in Brussels. So the trick is that President Macron will still attend the European Council, which is really, I mean, the political leaders driving, the EU policies. And you would have then national rally ministers participating to ministerial meetings in Brussels with more, I mean, it's still political, but it's more technical for sure than the European Council. So you would have, I mean, it would be what we call a cohabitation, but still with President Macron having the possibility to say what he wishes to say in the European Council. And I think that if he remains president, if he does not resign, because he said twice that he won't resign in any case, he will stay in the European Council, and he's not going to be in the mood, not to say anything in the European Council because it's a cohabitation period. So, I mean, it's going to be tricky for other European members to try, I think, to understand the narrative and the position of the French in Brussels, because then you would have different narrative, different expressions, and it's going to be difficult, I think, for the European Union to function properly in the next month, frankly.
And just to clarify, not to go down every scenario rabbit hole here, but since you just brought it up, and I do acknowledge that Macron has on a couple of occasions ruled out resignation, but the fact that you have to say it then puts it out there on the table. Where do you guys stand on that potential likelihood, assuming that would be more likely in a big RN sweep type of a scenario? But what would motivate him to actually do so? Or do you even see it as a possibility?
I mean, as Stéphane has said, he has very clearly discarded that possibility also, because if you think about the decision that he took, it wouldn't make any sense, right? Because if we assume that one of his motivations was to, keep the position of the presidency that allows him this public, speaking position to criticize whatever a potential national rally government would do, right? Ahead of 2027. So it wouldn't make sense for him to resign. Also, in my view, if he were to resign and a presidential election were to be called soon, Le Pen will be the next president of France within, 3 months, 4 months, whenever the election will be called. So I think for now, that it wouldn't make any sense for him, even if the national rally gets an absolute majority. It makes sense for him to stay in a cohabitation scenario to make life difficult for the national rally government, for example, by sending the laws to the Constitutional Court. I think under an absolute majority scenario for the national rally, we're going to hear a lot about the Constitutional Court. Normally, it depends on the country, right? But in France, you don't hear about them that often in the public media. Now we will be in a situation where they will be consulted quite a bit, and it will be they have veto power for laws, and you will have basically a President Macron that will be very outspoken, as Stéphane said, in the European scene, but also domestically against a national rally government.
So let's zoom out, Antonio, a little bit here and talk about the European parliamentary elections with regards to Europe as a whole. And I wanted to sort of divide this into two parts. First, the political implications, and then let's talk about the institutional developments that we're likely to see. So first of all, as I said in the introduction, the sort of the centrist parties ultimately prevailed, but give us the kind of the more detailed takeaway from the European parliamentary elections politically.
Yes, I think Stéphane summarized it at the beginning. I think there has been a lot of noise in the media because far-right parties did better than in the past. They increased the number of seats in the chamber. And at the same time, you have parties like the Greens doing more poorly than in the last election, which means that de facto you have a more conservative chamber, so to speak. But, the centrist parties still control more than 400 seats in the 720-seat chamber, which means that, they can still continue to pass legislation and cooperate to approve laws. Now, I think the interesting thing in this case is that the European People's Party, which is the center-right group in the European Parliament, it's a group where all the center-right parties of Europe sit together and becomes a central actor in this case, right? So a lot of what happens in terms of policy of the position of Parliament, because let's remind our audience, the European Parliament is just one institution in the institutional constellation of the European Union. You have the European Commission that proposes legislation and is the guardian of the treaty, so to speak. And then you have the Council of the European Union, which Stéphane has mentioned, where member states meet, right? And the European Parliament and the Council together, they co-legislate, right? They negotiate legislation. So the European Parliament, the position of the European Parliament, it will depend very much on what the European People's Party, the center-right group, does, right? Because they can opt for continuing to cooperate with centrist parties to pass certain policies, right, on internal market issues, for example, or they might want to actually tilt a little bit to the right with the ECR, which is the European Conservatives and Reformists, a far-right party led by the Brothers of Italy of Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, and maybe with the help of the Liberals, we have seen actually some votes in the last Parliament do an informal coalition to pass legislation in Parliament, right? So I think that's the main consequence of this election. The EPP, the European People's Party, is the crucial actor.
And I know you were talking a moment ago, Stéphane, about the institutional developments that will occur after. And I know that we won't fully have everything in place and so on until probably closer to toward the end of the year and whatnot. But one position that people will be focusing on, obviously, is the Commission President and whether Ursula von der Leyen will be reappointed and elected into that. Is that the sort of the baseline view right now, is that she will remain in position?
Yes, I think so, for the reason also mentioned by Antonio, which is the EPP won the election, and Ursula von der Leyen should be the candidate of the EPP. So I think that she will remain the president of the Commission, also because in those times of uncertainty, I think that it's reassuring to keep the same person as head of the Commission. So frankly, I think we'll have the answer at the end of the week, because there is a European Council meeting on the 27th and 28th, and they should decide, I think, really to confirm Ursula von der Leyen as the next president of the Commission. Yeah. And so, as you mentioned, Kevin, I mean, the process of choosing all the commissioners is really long and should be done, I think, at the earliest at the end of November, maybe January, frankly.
Got it. So, you both talked about the rise of the right in Europe, and yet at the same time we've seen some real dissension within those groupings, right? You've talked about Giorgia Meloni in Italy as taking a somewhat more pragmatic turn to get herself a bigger seat in European power politics. The AfD in Germany has had so many in-house scandals and whatnot that even Marine Le Pen saw fit to have to distance herself from it. And then you've got the sort of, the Viktor Orbáns of the world in Hungary, who are apologists for Putin and Russia, et cetera. How would you characterize the political far right and whether they can get their act together to be able to move en bloc, or do you see that this infighting within the groupings is something that's here to stay and they're just not disciplined? Antonio?
Sure. So I think, look, the infighting is here to stay because there are, it's not only that you have ideological differences over certain issues, it's also national differences. For example, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has refused to let Fidesz, its party, to join the ECR, the group of led by Meloni, because there is a Romanian party that has specific views on Hungarians in Romania, right? So he said, I will never accept that. So even beyond the ideological things that you have, for example, on Russia, you will have the Polish PIS, the party that lost the election, the last legislative election in Poland, which is really in favor of Ukraine, and Russia is the main enemy for them. Well, guess what? It's not for Orban, right? Which has been vetoing or blocking every single sanction package in the last 2 years, right? So I think foreign policy is an issue, but then you have small things in each different party that makes it very difficult for these parties to coalesce. Last point, you mentioned AfD. It's also that as some of these parties are trying to moderate, the new ones that are emerging still keep some of their extreme legacy, so to speak. And the case of the AFD is the most evident one, where due to a scandal, the AFD was part of the Identity and Democracy Group, where the National Rally sits, and it was expelled before the election campaign, right, because of this scandal. So I think it's going to be very difficult for parties, despite the fact that they're trying very hard to coalesce and become a very powerful group in Parliament, the European Parliament.
Yeah, maybe just one word also to, I fully agree with Antonio. And the fact is that I think we can conclude of the European elections that Meloni is one of the big winners of this election, because she won in Italy, and she really seems, I would say, she's from the Italian far right, but she does really well in Brussels, frankly, on economy. She did not oppose so firmly the Green Deal. So she seems someone you can talk to in Brussels, and you can deal, in fact. And my understanding of what she's doing through the ECR group, as Antonio mentioned, is that she has no incentive, I think, to do a deal with Marine Le Pen. Because the ECR is now the third group in the EP, after the EPP and the Social Democrats. And frankly, if she wants to be the deal maker, it's already possible for her. She doesn't need to ally with, to make a deal with Marine Le Pen, to have a bigger group. So for me, she has absolutely no incentive to do a deal with Marine Le Pen. She will, frankly, try to stay and to keep the ECR as it is, the third group, the deal maker in the EP, without the National Rally.
So let me ask you this. We're in a moment where it seems that, Europe is at kind of an inflection point in terms of how it is going to position itself in the world, in a world in which the United States' role is a little bit more in question, not only in terms of sort of running the global rules-based order to a degree, but also its security commitments in Europe, relations with China, which is obviously a juggernaut of an economy, as well as a security risk economically, but also with the increasing sort of axis of cooperation between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, let's say. At this moment, it would suggest that Europe's best shot is if it had a coherent and unified sort of position in the world. It's got the size of the economy, it's got the population, it's got the wealth. Having said that, that seems to require the two largest economies, France and Germany, to be in sync with each other as much as possible. It's quite clear that Chancellor Scholz and President Macron don't really see eye to eye with each other, but both of them also have their domestic politics that we've just been talking about. A German general election, I guess next year, am I right, Antonio? And and the French presidential election, notwithstanding everything we've just been talking about, French presidential election is just in sight down the road. So, what can we say about Europe's position in the world and geopolitically right now, given the dynamic that you guys have just been describing at an at an individual country level and at an institutional EU level?
Yeah, thanks, Antonio. Maybe I think for me, more protection and more protection. I think that will be the first mainstream policy of the next commission is to build a new not protectionists, but new tools to defend the European economy. It has been done through the foreign subsidy regulation, for instance, with new trade defense instruments. The European Commission has really the goal to be the global rule setter on digital, for instance. We saw that with the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, and it's going to continue and improve and increase. I think that, as Antonio said, we have an EP which is a bit more right than before. There is no big change in the council so far. But I think that the narrative and rationale for the next commission, the next EP, will be more protection, frankly, on economy, on immigration, on everything. Because I mean, politicians need to explain what Europe is doing for the citizens, for the consumers. Purchasing power is really issue number one in France. You know, and the national already also built its economic program on that, on national preference, but also on EU preference, for instance, on some issues, because they understand that there is an ECJ, a European Court of Justice, and they can do everything they want. So they will build, I think, a lot of protections. Yeah, they want to push through Brussels, through new regulations and new tools for the EU to protect its economy.
So in light of what Stéphane just said, Antonio, that, you know, and this was put on stark display last week when the European Union announced their EV policy with regards to China, and we see immediately dispatched to China the German Vice Chancellor and Economy Minister Robert Habeck, who's trying to, you know, mitigate, because, you know, Germany is the export and free trade. I mean, their economy is based on that model, essentially. And what Stéphane has just described is a pretty radical transformation for a country like that to have to look forward to in light of more coherent European policymaking. So that seems to be a big point of contention in European politics right there.
That's true, Kevin, but the reality is that, you know, in a world of increasing geopolitical competition, Europe has very bad cards, at least until recently, because Europe was designed to create peace, not to wage war, right? Even if it's economic war. And it was designed with the idea of promoting free trade in order to make the continent peaceful. And, you know, there was this idea as well of trading with other parts of the world to make the world more peaceful. So, you know, the software, so to speak, is not, you know, it needs to be changed for Europe to adapt to the new reality. Now, I think I completely agree with what Stéphane said. I think you have seen nothing short of I would say a revolution, a paradigm change under the last commission, where, you know, 5 years ago, you could still hear many officials talking about, you know, everything has to be WTO compliant, right? We need to comply with the laws of the World Trade Organization, and, you know, industrial policy, you know, it's only, you know, it has to be residual. Now we are openly talking, you know, Europe has developed trade defense instruments. It has become way more assertive towards China to rebalance the economic relationship, and is developing a full-fledged economic security agenda, right? So I think that's the way forward. I completely agree with Stéphane. Now, that being said, I agree with you, Kevin. It won't be easy because there are strong political differences inside Europe regarding some of these issues that are also motivated by the political economy of each country. I mean, you have a country like Germany that depends, its economy depends a lot on, you know, on the external sector, on exports, and China is a big market. It's not so big for France, right? So you have a divide there, but, you know, you also have divides on how to develop the defense sector and how to do joint purchases. Do we buy more American machinery and American weapons, or do we invest on European you know, machinery to develop that industrial sector specifically, right? So I think this is part of the fact that the European Union is a polity that is being built as we speak. It has been building for a long time, and you will have certainly these clashes. And at the end of the day, you know, you have some sort of agreement, which might be the minimum common denominator. But when push comes to shove, European leaders normally are able to agree on a way forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all become very experienced in seeing that the old adage that Europe is born out of crisis continues to play out. But having said that, turning away from the economy for just a moment, there's clearly also a difference of opinion in how to confront the Russia situation in Ukraine, and especially when we've clearly seen the impact on the battlefield of the delay in U.S. military and financial support from earlier this year, the toll that has taken. And there is, you know, especially if the U.S. election goes in the Trump direction, that there would potentially be less support coming from Ukraine for Ukraine from the United States. Where do you see Europe coming out on this, knowing that we've got some European leaders who are all in support for Ukraine, and others who are much more amenable to the Russian position. How do you read it right now?
Sure. I think if I may, Stéphane, I think the clearest example of why Europe remains committed to Ukraine, at least for the moment being, is the plan that has been just passed to use the profits from the frozen assets, from the frozen Russian assets to fund loans to Ukraine, right? A decision was taken by 26 member states, ex-Hungary, try to turn around, basically try to circle around the Hungarian veto to do this, right? So I think the commitment is there. It's interesting, by the way, when you look at this is a question that our clients asks us a lot. What happens with France if you have a national rally government regarding Ukraine? And it's interesting that Bardella, the national rally candidate yesterday, said actually that commitment should not change. We will put certain red lines, like for example, not sending troops to Ukrainian soil, right? Which at the end of the day is a way of differentiating himself from Macron, who said we should not discard that, right? But it was interesting to say, Russia is a multifaceted threat, which, by the way, coming from someone from the National Rally is a first, right? Because there is a history of people speculating about potential linkages of the National Rally with Russia, financial linkages, and so on. I think it's interesting that they're trying to detach themselves from that. And I think the Meloni example here is very powerful, right? In the sense that she realized that that potential association with Putin could be damaging, as it was for Matteo Salvini, the leader of the Lega in Italy. And very quickly, she aligned with the rest of the European consensus. And it seems, at least, for the words of the National Rally, if we take them at face value, that commitment might still be there, even in a scenario of a National Rally victory.
Stéphane, let me ask you the question a slightly different way. If you fast forward to the end of this decade, or let's say in the next 10 years, do you think that European military capability will look meaningfully different than it does today? And is that due to momentum within in Europe on this, or will that essentially be dictated by what the United States does and what Russia does in terms of driving that forward?
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. Frankly, we tried to build Europe de la Défense, the Europe of Defense, back in the 50s. And I think that it failed. It failed because it was maybe too early to try to have a Europe of defense. But now, frankly, I think that there is really a change in the European policy and in the understanding of the threat Russia represents for the EU. I think, as Antonio mentioned, I think this week it's the 14th sanctions package which has been adopted by the EU institutions, and there is now EU spending to buy weapons to be sent to the Ukrainian forces. You could not have imagined that 2 years ago. Frankly, that was not possible. I mean, the French were also always pushing, to try to integrate more defense spending at the EU level and so on, but it was not made. Now it's done, and I think that it's for instance, when you look at the polls in France, and one question was asked to the people, which was, are you in favor of a European army? And the answer was up to 70% yes. So in France, there is really the understanding that the EU is the right level to protect the economy, but also us as democracies, frankly. And the threat that Russia represents to the EU and to European democracies is really widely understood. That's the reason why also you can see a change in the national rally expression, as Antonio mentioned in the last weeks. For instance, and I just quote Jordan Bardella, who made a press conference yesterday. He said, "We will give logistical and material support to Ukraine." But during the European campaign, it was not that which was said. They said, we don't have to intervene in Ukraine because it's none of our business. And as Antonio mentioned, you have a difficult history between the National Front and Russia, because Russian banks financed the National Rally in the past, It's no longer the case, but still an issue. I mean, the relationship between the National Front and Russia, and Marine Le Pen met with Vladimir Putin a couple of times. So, I mean, there is an image of the National Rally being pro-Russians that they have to fight against now if they want to be respectable, let's say.
So we're at about time here, but I do want to ask one final question of you, Antonio, if I may, which is that next Thursday, July the 4th, is the day that is the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in the United States, and it would appear that the people of the United Kingdom are going to declare their independence from the Tory party. So tell us about what you're seeing and what our colleague Carsten Nickel is seeing right now with regards to the UK electoral dynamic. It appears that the only question really is one of degree. But what are you expecting?
Yeah, I'm still wondering whether Rishi Sunak, the current prime minister, was thinking about the historical connotation of choosing such a date. But I completely agree with you. I think it's a matter of range. All opinion polls point at a very strong victory by the Labour Party. And the question is the degree of the collapse of the Tory party, right? And I think that makes it very interesting because it's not so much about the election, but about what comes next in terms of both what the government will do and then what will happen with the Tory party, right? Will it become more to the right? Will it be absorbed, so to speak, by the hard right of reform, the party of Farage, of Nigel Farage, or will it become more moderate? Nobody knows at this stage. I think in terms of policy, in terms of Europe, we have been talking about Europe, right? I think what's interesting is that the Lib Dems, the Liberal Party in the UK, has been talking a lot about getting a better relationship, a better deal with Europe. Has been making some noises about getting to reduce the trade frictions between the UK and the European Union, because when you ask them about, okay, but should we renegotiate membership and then re-enter? No, that issue has been and it's not that it has been resolved, but it has been buried for a long time, right? But the problem is that the same trade-offs that you had in the past regarding market access remain. If the UK wants to have a closer relationship with Europe, it will have something to give in. And the issue is the next government ready to basically accept those trade-offs, right? For example, if you want to go way deeper, maybe you have to accept freedom of movement. I don't think that's something that the next government, at least at first, is willing to accept, right? So maybe this is a thing that's not going to happen in the short term. Some people are talking about a second term for Labour. I think, who knows in 5 years' time, but,
right,
that there might be policies down the line. But I think it's something that Labour is going to have to contend with if it really wants to have a closer relationship with Europe.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. For our audience, I should just say that Teneo will be closely monitoring the and releasing analysis on the election outcome in France after both the first and second rounds, as well as the UK election. We will continue to be monitoring developments in terms of European institutional development over the course of this year. So I want to thank both of you for joining me today, Stéphane Dupuis in Paris and Antonio Barroso outside Geneva. Thank you so much. And to everybody else, thank you for joining us. We'll be back soon with another edition of Teneo Insights. Until then, I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Have a great day.